Okay, welcome to June Gem number 7. This is going to be titled Your First Workflow. Now, with every workflow environment, I've always had like one workflow that I build just to make sure that everything kind of works. And that could be regardless of whether I have 10 SharePoint 2013 environments with Nintex Workflow installed and I go and build another one. I always kind of build something like this just to make sure all the bits and pieces are kind of working. So here's your workflow designer, right? You have your actions on the left that we mentioned earlier. You have your design canvas on the right. I always use this log in the history list action right there. Let's drag that across. There it is. And I just double click on it to open it up and just type in, this is a test. Okay. Now here's something else to think about when you're building that first workflow, but this is important for every workflow that you build. Click on the workflow settings button in the ribbon up here. Brings up the workflow settings. Give your workflow name. I always just put in first workflow. And you'll see there's a few things that are important right here. There's the start manually option. So do you want your workflow to start manually? Usually you probably keep this on. I think in production, if it's a event-driven workflow, like a workflow that starts on an item being created or modified or a document being created or modified, you generally turn the manually off. That's really only for debugging, unless you actually do have a specific business process that you need to manually start. Now, the important ones are right here. Start when items are created, or start when items are modified. Now, by default, they're set to no. And then you have the option to set them to yes if you want to, and you also have the option to do a conditional start. So I usually do this. Let's set them both to yes. We've got the name of our workflow, and we will publish this. I do recommend later on when you're actually building production ready workflows, make sure you put a description in here and any change comments when you actually make changes. It just helps to figure out what's changed in the past, especially if you build a workflow that you've made some sort of change and it has an adverse effect on the actual workflow. So this is publishing away. Now this is my local VM, so of course it's going to take a little bit of time as my CPU is grinding away. While this is happening, let's actually bring up, stay on this page. We'll go to another list. We'll actually go to the same list, but, there we go. But we'll actually keep the designer open. So I usually do this when I'm building workflows and I want to test them out a little bit. I have one tab that's the actual workflow and one tab that's the actual list. All right, so here's my test one item. I'm going to manually start this workflow and make sure that it works. First workflow. And when I run this workflow for the very first time, SharePoint will create me a column with the name of the workflow, and you'll see that in a moment. This should be a fairly fast workflow because it only has that one action in it. There we go, and there's that column, first workflow. Now you have a few things you can do. You can click on this, completed, and that should take you to the SharePoint out-of-the-box workflow history, and there is my test message. Right, that's my little message I put in my log action. So you can see this history is broken up into workflow history, into tasks, any tasks that have been assigned, and this is also something really good to keep an eye on, the status of the actual workflow. Sometimes it's in progress, sometimes it's completed, sometimes it's errored, and it can be other values if you choose to set those as well. Okay, so that's done. Now the other thing, this workflow should actually run if I create a new item. The only reason this won't run is because I'm set, it's all logged in as a system account. So we can actually try this out. I'm going to create a new item and we'll see if that kicks off this particular workflow or not. Now you can see I've got my test2 item that I just created and it did not kick off this workflow. Now that is because I am logged in as a system account. SharePoint will not start workflows if you are logged in as a system account. So that's just something to be aware of. So to get around that little issue of the system account, what I've done here is actually logged in as another user called VT2. That's my alter ego. Okay, so Let's click on new item. We'll just put in test 3 and click on save. Now notice no workflow has started. That's what you think. If you click refresh, there you see it started and it completed. Again, if I click on this, you can see it says this is a test. Okay. Now, the test 2 workflow that I created as a system account, it did not have a workflow start. So we have another event that we configured this workflow to start with, and that was on modified. Right, so if the item is modified. So let's go in here and edit this particular item and maybe call it test 2A. Click on save. Again, notice nothing has happened, but if I refresh, the workflow ran and completed. So we can see that both the workflow manually starts, the workflow starts on a created event, and also starts on an item modified event as well. So let's go back to the workflow designer and we'll change one little thing. We'll go back to the workflow settings, and now let's have a look at the conditional start. You're probably wondering, why would I want something to start on a conditional status, right? What this means is you want to have this workflow start when a particular event happens, rather than just an item is modified or an item is created. I want it to happen when an item is modified and a particular condition is met. So let's click on the condition option. There it is there. And you can see, first of all, you have a drop down. This will show you all the fields, all the properties on this particular item. Now, the really interesting thing to note is for each field that you have, there's also a previous value field. So now, if an item is created, or sorry, if an item is modified, you can actually check if the previous value does not equal the current value. I want this workflow to start. Or if the previous value happened to be, let's actually go over here and say, let's say, if the previous value for title equals test 2A, oops, there we go, and you got an and or an or condition here, and the current title equals test 2B, I want this workflow to start. Okay, now let's do that, and we'll click on save. Now what I want to do is actually change the log and the history section, because where we've got this is a test, if we run that on that test 2A item, what will happen is we'll get the same message and it'll be a little bit harder to confirm that this workflow ran. So I'm going to put a couple of asterisks there, just so we know that if this workflow, if the condition was met and it ran, we'll see this message. Okay, done. Let's publish this. And once that's done, we'll jump back into our other browser and we'll modify that particular item and see if it actually did do anything. So let's jump here, refresh that. Okay, so I'm going to modify the test 3 item first. Okay, let's go edit. Let's put a test 3A there and see if that does anything. All right, test 3A, click on save. This should modify the current item. Okay, I'll refresh it just in case and see if that particular workflow ran. Okay, still says completed, so we're not quite sure whether it actually did run or not. Let's click on this and see if it's the old workflow or the new workflow. It's still the old workflow, right? Still the old message. And notice up here the name of the workflow, and it's now got in brackets previous version, date and time. Now what that means is that this particular workflow, when it did run, it ran with an instance of a workflow based on a version that's different to the current version. So now let's see what it'll look like if I actually make the changes that I expected. All right, so and there's my test 2A item, and we're going to edit that particular item. So let's see, we're meant to change it from test 2A to test 2B, and we'll see if the workflow actually runs. So there's test 2B. Click on save. And once that happens, we'll refresh the list to see if that item was updated and that the workflow instance ran. So there's test 2B. Let's actually refresh this really quickly. Click on this completed, and there you see it says this is a test. It's got the asterisks at the beginning and at the end, and it just has the name of the workflow because it is the current published workflow. Okay, great. So basically with this simple workflow, all it does is log in the history list. If you go back into the settings, you can start it manually. It will start when an item is created, and it will also start if an item is modified and based on a specific condition, which is not very complex, but it's just a nice way to test out that all this stuff is actually working for you. Okay, that's your very first workflow. Should give you a little, good feel of how to drag an action onto the workflow, how to double click and configure it, how to go into the settings and set up some conditions for that particular or events for that particular workflow to start. Hopefully that helps you out with building your first workflow, and hopefully we can build some more complex workflows as we move on. Thanks for your time.